Share permissions. This is the beginning of a two-part discussion on permissions. The first kind of discussion we'll have is share permissions. And in the next nugget, we'll talk about NTFS permissions. You'll start off by looking at a basic configuration of how to configure your share permissions. And this will allow your resource to be available across the network to your users. And I'll show you also how to map network drives or to otherwise access a shared resource. We'll also take a look at administrative shares. This prevents you from having to create manual shares to administrator accounts. Instead, use the built-in administrative shares that allow you to access any hard drive, any drive letter on any current Microsoft operating system. And then we'll take a look at shared folders. This is part of the Computer Management MMC console. It allows you to do things such as disconnect users, send a message to a user, or actually it sends it to the computer, but the user can read it, and other things such as this, and you can even create remote shares using the shared folders item. We'll also look at effective permissions, which is very important to know. If you're a member of multiple groups, for example, that has shared permissions, all with varying levels of permissions, you need to know what the bottom line is, and then we'll take a look at updating security tokens, which is important if your group membership changes and you need access to a resource. Perhaps you have a safe deposit box, or you've seen them on television, and if you've seen them on television, they're like in a big bank vault, and inside the vault are all the safe deposit boxes. And probably only the manager knows the combination to the big bank vault door, but once he or she opens it, then just about anybody can pretty much walk in or out of there. It's just that you can't do anything there unless you have a key for your own safe deposit boxes, where the permissions, if you will, are much more granular because you have to be a renter and you have to have the key. Well, that's very similar to what we have with NTFS permissions and share permissions. Share permissions would be equivalent to the big bank vault door, which kind of opens it up for everybody to be able to go in, or at least a large quantity of people, and it's a little bit more of a general permission. On the other hand, we have NTFS permissions, which are a lot more like the safe deposit boxes. They're more specific in nature, they're more granular. You have to have a specific key, or in NTFS, you have to be a member of a certain group or a specific user in order to be able to have the ability to open up some of those files and folders, or safe deposit boxes, if you will. So let's get started with the share permissions. In order to do this, you as the administrator will go to a file location. In other words, in my case, I'm on the D drive for my local drive here on this server. Now, I can also do this remotely, and I'll show you how to do that shortly. But the easiest way for right now is just to do it locally. We simply right-click on it, and you saw me do this earlier with the Home and Profiles directory. We right-click on the data folder in this case and choose either Sharing and Security or Properties. They both open the same dialog box. It's just that Sharing and Security takes us right to the Sharing tab, whereas the Properties would take us to General instead. So it's kind of a shortcut for getting there. Saves you a click. And then we click on Share This Folder. Now, we'll just give it a share name of Data, and that will be the default. The same name as the folder is the name that appears here. And that's normally going to be okay unless you as the administrator have named the folder something that makes sense to you, but it doesn't make any sense to the users. So you would want to make it easy to understand here. And then you can also enter in a description, and if someone has the details turned on in their file browser, then they will be able to see a description for this folder. For this share. Let's go ahead and also take a look at the user limit. Normally it's the maximum allowed, which is the default setting, and that's okay for most purposes. You might also want to limit the number of users to a specific number here in case you want to make sure that only one or two people, for example, can access the resource at a given time. And this might be useful if you want to carefully gauge the number of people that can access it. And then you can also go to the permissions here. Of course, that's going to be important. You've got to determine who can access it, right? Well, guess what? By default, in down-level Windows, Windows 2000, for example, and Windows NT 4, then on the Permissions tab, you'll see that everyone is allowed full control. But in Windows Server 2003 and in Windows XP, if you create any shares from there, it's everyone read access. And that's part of Bill Gates' new initiative called the Trustworthy Computing Initiative. Of course, if you don't know Bill Gates, he's the founder and CEO of Microsoft. Or actually, he's the chairman. Now he's changed positions. But anyway, they've changed this to read-only permission, and the reason for that is because they want to tighten down security. The fact of the matter is, however, this is just a very rudimentary attempt at tightening down security, and it only prevents careless administrators from not really paying attention to what their permissions are. Anybody that's a careful administrator and responsible will go to this anyway and make adjustments as necessary. Now, I point that out to say that most administrators will go in here, and guess what we'll do? We'll click full control. Why? Because, remember, this is just the bank vault. We do want to open it up for broad access so that people can get in. We're going to use NTFS permissions later on to tighten this down, but we have to make it as open as possible in the beginning at least. Now, there may be incidents where you would need only read access. For example, if this share was for applications that people were going to run or something like that. Well, you don't want people to change or change permissions or anything like that for an application. So for that kind of a situation, you could leave it at read. In our case, we'll leave it at full control, and this is going to be often the case that you'll use for various types of data files that people will be reading, changing, and all that kind of thing. Now, having done that, there's also an offline settings button here, and we don't really address offline settings in this nugget particularly, but let me just point out that this will give you the opportunity to select how these files will be available, or if they'll be available, if the user who's trying to access the data does not have a network connection. And of course, the offline settings would just dictate how users can access data even if the network is down or they are physically disconnected from the network, such as a laptop user who's on an airplane. Offline files, which is what these offline settings allow, would allow you to have a copy of that data on your laptop, for example, and you can continue to work with it, and then when you reconnect to the network, it automatically synchronizes with the data that is physically on that file server. Now also notice that once I click apply here, I get a new button as well, and that is the new share button. We don't use this an awful lot, but this would give me the opportunity to make this data available to users under two different names, two or more different names. One, users could access it through just the user or the share name data. Well, I could also make it available through a different share name, maybe user data or whatever else I wanted up here, and then I could enter a description, maximum number of user limit, and the permissions as well. For example, the permissions here would be just read-only access, and maybe I'll just leave it at that, and then click OK. Once I click apply now then, any users that access the share through the data share would have full control as everyone. Anyone who accesses it through user data would have only read access control. Now, let me also point out that this only relates to network access, so that people accessing this through UNC path or through a mapped drive over the network, these share permissions are how they access the data and what their permissions are. If they have the ability to log on locally to this server, this file server, this domain controller, whatever it is, then they will be able to access the resource regardless of the share permissions, because this only has network relevance. If you want to more granularly configure the access locally, as well as further tuning it for over the network, then you will adjust NTFS permissions. By the way, there's also FAT file systems, or FAT or FAT32. We will not really be addressing that because Microsoft has pretty much just disregarded those file systems for most purposes, and they only have the ability to adjust share permissions like we're doing right now, and they have no ability to further control the permissions. Now let me also quickly just go to the web sharing tab here, and then we'll come right back to this. The web sharing is slightly outside of our scope for the time being because we haven't covered IIS yet. We will cover it a little bit later on, but if you want a real easy way to make a folder resource available on the internet using IIS, you can go to web sharing wherever that resource is located. For example, right now we're right-clicked on data, and then I can share it as a virtual directory underneath, in this case, my default website, which is the only one I have available. If I had others, they'd also be available through the drop-down here. And I'll simply click Share This Folder, and it asks what kind of resource permissions I want to access or to allow. I configure those here, and again, we'll cover what some of these are in a future nugget with IIS. But for the time being, I want you to at least know what that's about. Then let's go back to the Sharing tab here. Now then, I can also select one of these shares, like the user data share, for example, and click Remove Share, and that's exactly what it would do. It would leave me with only the data share at that point. But let's go ahead and just leave it as is. We'll click OK here, and now I'm going to go to a Client 01 computer here, where I'm logged on as Phoenix User 01. So I'm just a Windows XP computer logged on as a domain user. And in order to access the share over the network now from here, I can either have my administrators map a drive for me through a logon script, for example, or I can go to my computer, and you can always map drives through going through Tools and then Map Network Drive, and then you can browse for the location as necessary. So I can click here and browse through network places, in this case nuggetlab.com. Then I could go to whichever server has the share, DC Nugget 1 in this case, and then Data and OK, and then I would map it to Drive Z. Notice, by the way, it maps drive letters for network shares starting at the bottom of the alphabet, and that's the case ever since Windows XP and Windows Server 2003 now. And the reason why it does that is so that it doesn't accidentally collide with removable drives that are further up the alphabet here and confuse things that way. Now this would be a common way to do it as an adept user that knows how to map a drive. Unfortunately, a lot of users don't know how to do that, so they will still have to depend mostly on network administrators to create network shares for them using drive letters in logon scripts. Now then, the other way for me to do this, if I directly know the locations, I could just backslash DC nugget 1 backslash, and then notice that it automatically fills in all of the shares available over on DC nugget 1, including my printers, such as this Samsung printer and this Hewlett-Packard printer right here. Well, this is done through something we call crawling, and this is a new feature starting with Windows XP that allows us to kind of auto-fill in these things. It makes it a little bit easier to access network resources. I'll simply click on Data here, if it allows me to. There we go. Click on Data, and then it shows us all the resources down through here. Now, I'm accessing this through the data share, so if I go to Assistance, then I'm allowed everyone full control, so I can just right-click here, New, just create anything, a text document here, for example, and I can open this up, enter in any text, and save it, and I have full control over it. Now, if I were to change how I was accessing this share, remember that was through the other share, and that was through the user data share. Now if I go into that same resources actually, but I'm in different permissions. Now if I go to the Assistance or something like that, try to create a new document here, notice that I'm access denied. That's because I got only read access through the user data share. Now then, in reality, we don't do that very often where we have multiple share names, but it can be handy, and once again, it might be useful if you want to restrict certain users according to their share permissions. But with NTFS file systems, it's much better if you use NTFS permissions, which we will discuss a little bit later on. Now, let me also show you what exactly it is beneath the scenes here, behind the scenes, that allows us to access those things. And as Phoenix User 01, I can look at my network properties. So I'm going to right-click my network places and choose Properties. I'm going to show you the network configuration on the local area connection here, and it'll give me a message here in a moment that says I can only view the property sheet. That's okay. I don't want to change anything anyway right now. But what I want to point out is that the client for Microsoft Networks is also known as the Workstation Service, and that's what it starts, is the Workstation Service. So that if I deselected this as an administrator, it would no longer enable the Workstation Service, which would otherwise start automatically. And that allows me to access resources across the network as a client. I also have the file and printer sharing for Microsoft Networks, so that if I had a local printer attached here, or I wanted to create my own file share on this XP computer, then I would be able to do that because this is also selected and installed. And that would start up what we call the server service. Even though I'm on a Windows XP client, it's still called the server service, makes those resources available for us. Now then, a little while ago, I showed you how you can map a drive from My Computer or Windows Explorer by clicking on Tools and Map Network Drive. You can do the same thing from a command prompt or a run line on Start Run, and then just simply type in net use, and then the drive letter you want to use, Z for example, in my case, and then backslash, the name of the server, the name of the share, and then you simply press enter. And this is the same syntax that you will use if you're going to use something like a CMD or a BAT or batch file to map network drives for your users automatically. So you just enter net use drive letter and then whack whack name the server and share. By the way, I thought of naming my server Patty. That way it'd be whack whack patty whack. Aren't I a funny guy? Okay, now if you decide you don't want the drive letter anymore, you just go do a net use, and then you do a Z colon or whatever your drive letter is, and the /del for delete, and that will then delete that. But before I do that, let me just go ahead and prove that it did actually map the drive for you. So I got my drive Z down here, double click on it, and I see the resources there. Also, let me point out that if you click up here, this does not take you up on the physical directories over on that file server. The up in that case over there would take me right to the root of drive D. In this case, it won't do that. It just takes me to my own local root of my computer here. And this will help to prevent users from browsing resources that they're not supposed to be able to access. Oh, also, before I forget, let me point out that if I want to, at the end of this, I can put a / persistent : and then a no. And that way, it would prevent this drive mapping from being persistent, and it would not be able to survive a reboot. In this case, it normally defaults to persistent yes, even though we don't see it typed in over here, and it would survive a reboot. I would only want to make it not persistent probably if I'm an administrator temporarily creating a drive mapping here, only for troubleshooting purposes or something like that. In any case, I'm going to go ahead and delete the drive letter now, press enter. Then if I go back to my computer once again, of course, we'll see that drive Z is now missing. You can also do the same thing on a map drive by right-clicking on it and choosing disconnect. Now there's another important thing about sharing of which you should be aware, and that's something called the administrative share. So for example, if I even go to my local hard drive here and right-click on it and choose sharing and security, we'll see the administrative share because all drive letters on current Windows operating systems are shared out as the drive letter with a $sign, and there's no way to really remove it down here. Now, I could choose do not share this folder, but if I click OK or apply, all that happens is it gives me a message saying that as soon as the server service is stopped and restarted, or the computer is rebooted, which essentially stops and starts the server service, then it's going to restart the share of C $sign. So if I click yes here to stop sharing C $sign, it's only going to be temporary. It'll come back. Now, the usefulness for that C $sign is as long as I'm an administrator on the machine to which I want to connect, I can whack name of the server or workstation and the name of the drive letter I want to connect to, and you always enter that with a $sign at the end. So in this case, C $sign, press enter. That takes me to the local resources over on client 01 as if I were seated there locally. And I can do just about anything I want to with this in terms of the NTFS permissions, which we'll look at in the next nugget. Or I can also look at just any files and folders that I want to access here, modify, have pretty much full control here, as if I were seated locally. Now, when it comes to shares, for example, if I would have a folder here that was called, just share, we'll just call it for the time being. Notice that if I try to adjust the share permissions remotely through an administrative share and go to properties, there is no sharing tab here. And it is not possible to administer the shares remotely through the file system the way I'm doing it right now. I can only go here to the security tab to adjust my NTFS permissions. Now I can look at all of the shares, including the administrative shares and those that were created manually, by going to My Computer, right-clicking and choosing Manage. And from here there's a Shared Folders item, and I can click on this and look at the shares. Here it shows me all the administrative shares, which again end in a $sign, such as the admin $sign, which takes me to the system root, which is by default C:\Windows on most systems. Or I could just go to C $sign. That's what I usually do anyway, instead of going here. Just less typing to do when I enter in the UNC path, and I just double-click on what I want. Then there are other shares, such as the data share, which I created manually, and which, of course, you see do not have the $sign at the end. Now, if I want to, I can also create new shares from within this interface by right-clicking shares and choosing New Share, and this takes me through the Share Folder Wizard. From here, I'll simply enter in a folder path, which of course I can browse for, and I'll just locate something that I want to share down through here, and I would access it. If I don't have the folder that I need, I simply create a new folder, and I'll just call it whatever I need, projects for example. Click OK, and it's a pretty simple wizard. You just kind of next your way through it, and read a description if you want to. Then again, I can set my offline files if I want to. Click on Next, and then here I do have a little bit of a difference. I can have all users have read-only access, which again means everyone read access, or I can have administrators have full access, other users have read-only access, and administrators have full access, other users have read and write access, or I can customize the permissions and then just customize here, and it brings up the familiar dialog box that we've seen before. Just for fun, let's go administrators have full access, other users have read-only, and we'll see that once I finish this wizard, that when we go to the file system on D, and I go to the project's share, that we see that the permissions allows administrators, as expected, to have full control, but everyone else has read access. Now notice also within the Shared Folders item I have an Open Files item, and I can use this to see what files or folders the user is accessing. It says Open File, but it really accesses everything from their SharePoint on down to the user's current location. So the user has double-clicked on data, they've double-clicked on their assistance folder, and they've double-clicked and opened and apparently saved a file called weeklyprojects.txt. Now the actual specific files kind of fades in and out, just to be honest with you about this. The user saved it recently, and so it kind of triggered it here and shows up. If I refresh the screen, it'll go away, even though the user in reality still has that file open. So you cannot depend on that to show you exactly all the files that are currently open, just so you know. Although Microsoft will say that this is a good tool to see that. Now, let me also point out here, by the way, that it kind of is misleading in what you can do. For example, the user has the weeklyprojects.txt file open. If I right-click on it, it makes it look as if I can close that open file so that it just disappears from the user's screen. But if I click on that and say yes, go back to the user over here, what do you know, but they still have the file. And they can still save it, file, save, all this kind of stuff. This does not really mean that it forcibly closes the file on the user. It just closes that connection. But you see, since the user has this document in memory, if they just choose to save it again, then it will reestablish that connection automatically. And the same thing would hold true for anything else that they have open, such as the open access to the share point itself. We can right-click here, choose Close That Open File, say yes. But in reality, once again, all the user has to do is to access something within this folder, double click on it, create something new, whatever they want to do. This does not restrict them from access. It's just a very temporary item in terms of cutting that off. Now, that was always fairly simple kinds of files and folders. There are some kinds of files that would be locked as well. For example, where it says number of locks, this relates to whether or not that file is locked open. Now, also, this just gives you the other rudimentary information. It tells you who's accessing the file or folder. It tells you what kind of access they're accessing. It could be with NetWare or Macintosh as well, depending on which client they're using. We're obviously using a client for Microsoft Network, so it's the Windows type. Applications will often lock a file so that it cannot be modified by other parties, so it'll tell you whether or not it's locked. And it tells you what mode it's in, whether it's read mode or what access the user has as they access the resource. Now, there are some kinds of files that could cause a problem if you go ahead and disconnect them. Now, I did that just with a plain text file, which was memory resident. There are other kinds of files that might not be so easily closed without the user losing data, and which would indeed cut the user off. So you might want to be careful with that, and if you're going to do that, to cut somebody off from a share, you might want to go to the shares item here first, right-click, and then choose All Tasks, Send Console Message. So you can send them a message first saying, hey, I'm about to disconnect you or something. So I might send a message like this, your files are about to be closed, please save, and then I can select the recipient down here. This will show me all of the computers that are currently connected to this system, and I can simply select all of them, or I can remove them as necessary, and of course you see that you can also add if you want. And then I'll just click Send. Then if I go over to that client, I see that it's received this from the messenger service, which does have to be running in order for this to work. Now, the final part of the shared folders item is the sessions section. This tells me who has an established connection to this server. It tells me what the username is, Phoenix User 1, of course, which computer name is, what kind of client it is, if it's Windows, of course, if they have any open files and how many, how long they've been connected, and how much of that connected time has been idle. Also shows me whether or not they're connected with a guest account. Now remember, I mentioned a while ago that you can browse the file system on a remote machine by going to an administrative share such as $, but that you cannot create or administer shares through that $, share. However, if you connect to another computer using computer management by right-clicking on computer management and clicking Connect to another computer, then you can enter in the name of that system, DC Nugget 2, for example, in this case. And then I can go back down to the shared folders item where I have the shares, right-click here, choose a new share, and this would allow me to create, or rather to use the wizard that you saw me use earlier to create a share on that remote system. Now you see that I've allowed everyone full control on that share. That's not always appropriate, but just so that you know how to manipulate that and to manage that, let's go back to that data share and remove everyone full control and add specific groups instead. Now, for the groups, I've gone offline here and created 4 groups that we could potentially work with. We might not use all of them, but I just created something to work with here. Phoenix admins, assistants, HR, and managers, which correspond to the folders that you see under here. So now I'll just right-click on the data share, go to Sharing and Security, and here in Permissions, let's say we don't really want everyone full control because we don't want this to be a publicly browsable folder. If it was something else like a company information page or some other kind of broad page, we might be able to use that, but in this case we want to just give HR admins full control, Phoenix admins, and we'll give Phoenix admins full control. Now, while I'm here, let me also point out what the varying levels of permissions are. They kind of are self-explanatory, but I'll be more specific. Read just means that. You can only display file names and folder names, and you can also display the data, so I could double-click on a file and open it. But I couldn't make any changes to anything that I see. I can also read the attributes of a file, for example, whether or not it was read-only. Change adds everything that I have in the read permission, plus change will also give me the ability to create files, to create folders, to add files to folders, to make modifications to the data in those files, change the file attributes, and I can also delete files and folders if I want also. Then the full control has everything in read and change, plus the full control will also allow me to do 2 other key things. One of those is to take ownership of files, and the other one is to change file permissions. So for most of your users, they will be just fine with change control. They'll be able to work with, manipulate, and change their data just as they probably need to on a day-to-day basis. But we as admins might need to change permissions on certain resources, might need to change ownership on resources. So that's why we would give the Phoenix admins, in this case, full control. And I'll just apply that. Now, we can also go and add another group. Let's say Phoenix Now, Phoenix managers, so I'll add them into this. The Phoenix managers don't really have administrative requirements such as changing ownership and all that kind of thing. They just want to be able to manipulate data as necessary, so we'll give them change permissions. Then we also have assistants to all departments, so I could click on assistants here. And Phoenix assistants are in here now. But the Phoenix assistants really only need to read the information that's in these files. So in that case, that's all I would give them is just read permissions. So I'd click OK, and then I'd click on Apply, and then that's what the permissions would be. Now another issue of which you should be aware is what happens if the user is a member of multiple groups. What if I'm a member of managers and assistants? So maybe I'm a manager, but I manage all of the assistants. So I need to access resources that both of these groups have access to. Well, what do I have? Since I'm a member of this group, do I get only read control when I access this folder? Or do I get managers change control when I access this shared folder? What's it going to be? Really what you do with this is you add the permissions up so that they are cumulative. We start with read-only access. We go to the managers group. We see that it's added change control, so you add read plus change. The maximum you have is change control if you're a member of both of these groups. Another simple way to think of this, I think, is just to think of what the most liberal permission is. If I'm a member of both these groups, I know that with my shared permissions, I always get the most liberal between the two. So in this case, since the most liberal permissions are managers change control, that's what I have. Now, I could also add an individual user here, or group, but I could, let's say, add an individual user that's a Phoenix assistant, and we are just training them. We have not cleared them for some of the confidential documents we have, so we don't want them to be able to access this at all, even through their read permissions. So that they're a member of this group, we still don't want them to read anything. What we can do is to add that individual user, Phoenix user 08, for example, and we'll check their name to make sure I typed it in right, okay. And now, Phoenix user 08, I can deny them whatever level of permission I want. For example, I can just deny read, deny change, or deny full control. And in this case, I might just deny full control entirely. And the thing to remember here is that deny always overrides. So that if I have membership in one of these groups where I have more liberal permissions like Phoenix Assistants where I would be able to read this, well, if I'm a Phoenix user 08 and a member of this group, now that I've got a deny permission, it overrides everything else that I've got, and the deny always denies. And that's further evidence. Once I click OK or Apply here, it gives you this message saying that deny always overrides everything else. Are you sure you want to continue? Yes. This is meaning that this user 08 will always be denied. Now, in reality, I only had to click on the read deny because they're only a member of the Phoenix Assistance group, which only had read access in the first place, but we'll just go ahead and be more broad in that scope. Okay, so we click OK and OK, and then let's go ahead and check it out. What we'll do is log on as users of members of the various groups to see what kind of access we have. So here you see me logged on as Phoenix user 01. I've added Phoenix user 01 to the Phoenix admins group. And when we go to the SharePoint at DC Nugget 1 data, we see that the Phoenix admins can go to some folder like HR down here, and we can right-click and choose a new document if we want to. Phoenix, hrservers.txt, for example, and we can go in there, and maybe we just have a list of servers or something like that. So then we can save the document, and we have full control, so everything looks just fine as we would expect. Now here I've logged on again as Phoenix user 02. Phoenix user 02 is a member of only the assistants, the Phoenix Assistants group. So if they go into the same document that had been created earlier, HR servers, and they try to make any changes to this, then when they click on File and Save, they'll get an error message. So we're not able to make any changes there, and we'll just have to cancel out of everything. Likewise, they wouldn't be able to create any new documents here either because they don't have that kind of permission. They only have read-only access. Now here I'm logged on as Phoenix user 05, and this group membership is of both Phoenix Assistants and of the Phoenix Managers, so that when I go to the HR folder in this case, or any of these other folders, now in this case I can right-click and choose New Text Document, because although I only have read permissions in the Phoenix Assistants group, I have change permissions in the Phoenix Managers group, so it allows me to create this document without any error messages. So I'll just put in here, managed employees or whatever else I want to name it, and then of course we can make changes to this. And we'll just add a couple of names there, and you see that I can click on Save without any problem. Now here I've logged on as Phoenix User 08. Remember, Phoenix User 08 is explicitly denied share permissions to this folder, to this network resource, even though they're allowed read permission in their assistance. Well, remember that deny always overrides everything else. So then, if we try to UNC to DC Nugget 1 in the data folder share, and press enter, we're going to be denied access immediately because we are Phoenix User 08, which has the explicit deny permission. Now then, finally, here I am logged on as Phoenix User 09. Now let me go ahead and first go back over to our file system and to our Active Directory users and computers and point out that Phoenix User 09 is a member of the Phoenix admins group. And although they're currently logged on as Phoenix User 09, I just now add them. I'm just now going to click OK, so they are now a member of that group. Now, it's easy to think that once I have done that, if I just right-click on my computer, choose Explorer, and browse to the appropriate location, Phoenix 1 Nugget 1 data, DC Nugget 1 data, ooh, I'm access denied. Well, that can't be right. Why? Because I'm a member of the appropriate group, aren't I? If I double-click my membership, yeah, Phoenix admins. I should be able to get in there. In fact, I'm supposed to have full control according to what the share permissions are on it. Well, what this has to do with is the fact that I am still logged on as Phoenix User 09 at the time that the administrator changed my group membership here. So when you log on, what also happens is there's a security token that's created for the user. It includes a SID for Phoenix User 09, and it includes a SID for any group memberships they have. In this case, they're only a member of the domain users group. So the domain users group doesn't have any access to the share, neither does Phoenix User 09 by itself. Therefore, they're denied access. In order for this to work, if my membership has been changed while I was currently logged on, I would have to first log off, and then when I log back on again, it would generate a new security token for me, which would have my new SID for my new group membership in the Phoenix admins group. And in that case, I'd go ahead and log on. So now when I log on with Phoenix User 09's password, and I open up Windows Explorer, this time I'm going to be able to go ahead and actually access that resource because it now has the correct security token, including the correct SIDs necessary to access that resource. So DC Nugget 1, data. Now I can access it, and now I would then have full control because of my membership. And this is a very common and often used troubleshooting tip for you. If a user is supposed to have the appropriate group membership and they can't seem to access it anyway, if their membership change was recent, have them log off and then log back on again, and there's often a pretty good chance that they will be able to access the resource that they need. In this nugget, we started a discussion of shared permissions, which is part of a two-part discussion, the second half of which will be in the next nugget on NTFS permissions. Here we talked about how to configure your shared permissions so that users can access resources over the network, and then I talked about how to map drives for those users so that they can access them through a drive letter. We also took a look at administrative shares, which allows you to connect remotely to a file server, or any server really, or any other kind of workstation that's a current Microsoft operating system, and you can do that without having to manually create shares. We also looked at shared folders. The shared folders is part of the MMC console for computer management, and with this we can create remote shares, disconnect files, all that kind of thing, as well as we can look at effective permissions. And this is important to know with shares because you might be a member of multiple groups, for example, that have varying levels of permissions, and you need to know what the bottom line is there, and I talked about that. We also took a look at updating tokens. You might have change in your group membership recently that has either supposed to allow you access or maybe even deny you access, but it's not taking effect quite yet because you need to update the security token by logging off and logging on. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.